The wolf was dying. Becca pressed her small hand against the cold iron bars, and the sensation struck her like a wave breaking over a cliff, vast, unstoppable, salt-stinging and complete. Pain radiated through her palm and up her arm, burrowing into her chest until it settled like a stone behind her sternum. Not her pain. His. She had long since learned the difference between feelings that belonged to her and feelings borrowed from the creatures around her, but this wolf made that distinction nearly impossible. His suffering was so immense, so layered and complex, that it threatened to swallow her whole. She had felt grief before, the hollow, echoing kind that lived in Uncle Hemer's farmhouse like a permanent resident. She had felt rage, the banked coals of it that smoldered in her cousins whenever they looked at her. She had felt fear, mean and petty and sharp. But this was different. The wolf's emotions were not small, cramped human things. They were mountainous. Oceanic. They carried the weight of years behind them, of a mind that had thought and dreamed and planned and loved, now compressed into a cage barely large enough for his body. Underneath the agony, and she felt it as physical agony, her bones aching sympathetically with his, was a rage that burned like the heart of a forge, white-hot and relentless. And beneath even that, buried so deep she almost missed it, a grief so personal and precise it could only belong to someone who remembered exactly what had been taken from them. The creature inside the cage was enormous. Silver-furred and matted with filth and dried blood, his ribs pressed through his coat like the staves of a broken barrel. His paws, resting on the earthen floor, were the size of dinner plates. When she had first glimpsed him 3 weeks ago from the edge of the clearing, she had thought he was a trick of the moonlight. Wolves did not grow to the size of horses, their fur did not shimmer like hammered metal, their eyes did not glow with banked intelligence. And yet, it was his eyes that had undone her then. It was his eyes that kept pulling her back. Storm gray, shifting like cloud cover over deep water. They tracked her as she crouched just outside the reach of his cage, and in them she saw the thing that had made her breath catch on her first night here, the thing she could not stop thinking about in her thin attic bed while the farmhouse settled and creaked around her, recognition. Not the simple awareness of a caged animal registering a human presence. Something more devastating than that. He knew what she was. He understood, with those ancient eyes, that she could feel him. And in the knowing was something both desperate and careful, like a drowning man who has finally spotted a rope but is afraid to believe it is real. Becca sat cross-legged in the dirt, 6 feet from the bars, and let him look at her. This was what she had learned over 17 visits, the wolf needed time. He needed to believe she would not vanish, would not hurt him, would not turn out to be another cruelty dressed in a gentler face. She had patience in abundance. She had spent 10 years being still. The compound around her was quiet at this hour. The guards changed at dusk, and she had learned that the half-hour window between the old shift's departure and the new shift's establishment was the compound's most porous moment. She had also learned where the gap in the fence was, a section of iron spikes that had rusted through at the base, leaving a space just wide enough for a small girl to squeeze through on her belly. She had developed bruises from it that she wore like a private language, a secret correspondence with the only being who had ever truly seen her. The wolf lowered his head slowly, his massive body shifting with the labored care of something in genuine pain. Even this small movement sent a ripple of sensation through Becca's gift. She felt the pull of his wounds, the deep bone ache of malnourishment, the specific burning misery of the iron bars whenever his fur brushed them. The cage was not merely iron. The bars were inscribed with symbols that swallowed light rather than reflecting it, runes that created a blank, painful silence in her empathic sense, a void that hurt the way an absence hurts, the way the space where her mother's voice used to be still hurt, even after 5 years. And yet through that void, his emotions leaked. They were too powerful to be entirely contained, too vast to be smothered even by whatever dark magic had been used to forge his prison. They reached her like fire through stone, diminished, but unmistakable. She had brought him something tonight. A piece of dried venison she had stolen from the farmhouse larder, wrapped in a cloth she kept in the secret pocket she had sewn into the lining of her coat. She pushed it through the bars and then sat back, giving him space to decide. He sniffed it, once, twice, his nostrils working carefully, and then ate with a delicacy that made her throat tight. Not the desperate gulping of a starving animal. Something deliberate and dignified, as though he was choosing, in this small way, to maintain a self. Then she did something she had never done before. Becca's gift had always been involuntary, a passive instrument for receiving the emotional weather of the world. It was not a choice she had made. It had made her, shaped her, defined the boundaries of her existence long before she was old enough to understand why she could not be in a room full of people without wanting to press herself into a corner and disappear. She was a vessel, endlessly filled with things that belonged to others. But sitting in the compound's dirt, her hand resting near the bars, she felt the wolf's pain pressing against her chest like a living thing, and something shifted in her. She did not want to simply receive him. She wanted to answer. It was not words. Becca had no words, spoken or otherwise, had not produced them since she was 5 years old, since whatever illness had taken her mother had taken Becca's voice along with it, had stripped the sound from her but left everything else horribly, exquisitely intact. She could not answer him in language. But she had something else. She closed her eyes and reached inside herself, past the constant noise of borrowed emotion, past the walls she had spent a decade building to keep the world at a manageable distance. She found something quiet there, a pool of stillness she had discovered on her first day in the forest behind the farmhouse, when the trees had offered her nothing but the honest simplicity of their own animal residence, the particular contentment of a sparrow eating seeds, the drowsy satisfaction of a hedgehog settling into its den. She cupped that stillness in her hands, the way she might cup water, and she pushed it outward. She offered him the forest as she knew it. The way sunlight came through oak leaves in October, gold and amber and impossibly warm for the season. The sound of a stream over smooth stones, which she knew he could not hear but which she could render as pure feeling, the sensation of cool, of clarity, of movement without urgency. The simple peace of watching a hawk ride a thermal upward until it was a pinprick against a white sky. She offered him a moment of rest. A moment outside his cage. The wolf's eyes went wide. She felt the shift in him as though it had happened in her own body, the constant roar of his suffering quieting, not gone, but briefly moved aside, the way a storm can pause between its greatest violences and reveal, for just a moment, the silence underneath. And into that silence bloomed something that made tears prick the corners of her eyes. Gratitude. Wonder. And beneath both of those, an emotion so precise she almost could not name it, the specific, overwhelming relief of a person who has been alone for so long they have begun to believe that no one else in the world speaks their language, suddenly hearing their name called in a familiar voice. He understood. He understood exactly what she had done and what it meant. The wolf moved toward the bars with the painful deliberateness of something that hurt with every step, and lowered his enormous head until his nose almost rested against her fingers. The gesture was unmistakable. Becca had felt the body language of 1,000 animals, had learned to read their intentions in the textures of their emotions, and she knew this for what it was, an offering of trust. An acknowledgement of equals. She reached out and let her fingers brush the silver fur of his muzzle. The images came like a flood tide she had not anticipated. Not clear pictures, not the sharp-edged memories of her own mind, but impressions, emotional photographs, saturated with feeling rather than color. A castle of white stone rising from a hillside. Inside it, corridors where people moved with the fluid confidence of those who had never been afraid of themselves, people who might be walking upright one moment and running on 4 legs the next, as naturally as changing clothes. A throne room where a woman with silver hair and storm-gray eyes, the same eyes, she realized, the exact same eyes, ruled with a warmth that her formality could not quite conceal. A childhood full of noise and motion and love, of playmates who shifted forms mid-chase and laughter that echoed through trees older than recorded history. Then, a betrayal. Not the betrayal of an enemy, which would have been survivable. Something worse. A trusted face, a familiar smell, and magic that came from behind. Chains that she felt as though they were wrapped around her own limbs, specifically not metal, but intention, dark wool wrapped in ancient formula, a curse designed not to imprison the body but to trap the mind inside the body's limitation. To lock a man inside a wolf's form, fully conscious, fully remembering, fully knowing. Aware of every moment of its own imprisonment. Becca yanked her hand back, gasping. The wolf, no, not just a wolf, something else, something she did not yet have a word for, watched her with those storm-gray eyes. In them she read the question as clearly as any spoken sentence. Do you understand now? Do you see what I am? She nodded, her face wet with tears she had not noticed beginning. She saw. She understood. He was like her, in the way that mattered most, trapped in a form that did not allow him to speak, imprisoned by a fate he had not chosen, crying out in a language that the people around him could not hear. Except now, at last, someone could. 3 weeks earlier, the forest had been doing what it always did when Becca needed it most, nothing in particular. That was the point. The farmhouse required constant management. Uncle Hemer's bitterness was a presence like smoke, invisible but inescapable, working its way into everything. It lived in the timbers of the walls and the cracks in the floorboards and the particular way he looked at Becca across the supper table, not with cruelty, exactly, but with a cold, bone-deep resentment she had spent 4 years trying not to take personally. She reminded him of her mother. She reminded him of the debts her mother had left. She reminded him, every day, that his life was smaller than he had intended it to be, and that the girl eating bread at his table was somehow implicated in that diminishment. Aunt Meredith was a different creature altogether. Where Hemer burned with buried fire, Meredith had no fire at all. Her emotional signature was the flattest Becca had ever encountered in a living person, not peace, which had its own warmth, but a profound and practiced absence. She had, at some point long before Becca arrived, simply stopped feeling things she could not control, and the blankness of it was, in its own way, more frightening than Hemer's rage. The cousins, Dav, Peter, and little Moll, who was not little and not kind, had the casual cruelty of children who have absorbed their parents' frustrations and learned to spend them on whatever target was safest. Becca was the perfect target. She could not tell on them. She could not explain to anyone what they did, because she had no voice, and even if she could have found a way to communicate the things she felt from them, the petty satisfaction of knocking over a plate she had just washed, the bright, ugly pleasure of a whispered name called across a table just loud enough for her and not adults, who would have believed her? The mute orphan dumped on our doorstep was how Hemer had described her to a neighbor once, not knowing Becca was on the other side of the parlor wall, listening with her skin. She felt the truth of how he saw her in the words. That was the worst part of her gift, she always knew. So the forest. The forest, where the animal's emotions were clean and honest and contained, hunger, contentment, fear, safety, the warm specific love of a mother rabbit for her kits, the pride of a fox at the edge of its territory. These feelings made sense. They did not lie to themselves. They did not say one thing and mean another. On the afternoon that changed everything, she had been following a young deer, a buck still in his first year, his antlers just velvet nubbins above his dark eyes. She had not been hunting him. She had been accompanying him, sharing in the pleasant contentedness of his afternoon browse, letting the simple animal satisfaction of it wash the farmhouse off her. Then the deer had frozen, every muscle locking in a single instant, she felt it, the terror, like a switch thrown, and bolted. She was alone in an unfamiliar part of the forest. The pain hit her from a direction she could not name, like a sound too low to hear that she felt instead in her molars, in her sternum. Not the simple distress of a wounded animal. This was layered. It was old. It had architecture, the way only human-adjacent minds build emotion, story upon story of experience, a tower of feeling that stretched further up than she could see. Her feet turned toward it before she consciously decided to move. The brambles caught her dress and her arms. She registered the scratches distantly, filed them away to deal with later, and pushed through into a clearing that should not have existed. The compound was crude but purposeful, 3 long wooden buildings arranged in a U-shape, high fences topped with iron spikes, men moving between structures with the blunt, purposeful energy of people engaged in work that required not thinking too hard about its nature. She felt them from where she crouched in the tree lean, greed, a thick, fatty satisfaction with their situation, a casual indifference to suffering that was somehow more disturbing than active cruelty. Men who had, through long practice, simply stopped extending moral consideration to anything that might cost them. At the center of the courtyard, a cage. At the center of the cage, a source of pain so vast it should have been audible. She stayed in the tree lean for a long time, watching, listening with her skin. The cage was black iron inscribed with symbols she had never seen before, and even from this distance the symbols did something strange to her gift, not blocking it entirely, but dampening it, like a thick cloth over a lantern. And yet the wolf's anguish still reached her. Too much of it, contained in too little space. She did not leave. She should have. She knew she should have. She was 10 years old, alone, in unfamiliar woods, and the men in that compound moved like people who would not trouble themselves overmuch about the fate of a child who wandered into their business. But the wolf. The wolf looked at her. Magnificent, isn't he? The voice came from behind her, and she spun so fast she nearly lost her footing. A man stood at the edge of the clearing, tall, lean, dressed in clothes that belonged in a city counting house rather than a forest clearing. Dark coat, silver buttons, hands pale and long-fingered. His face was sharp, angular, all blade and no warmth, with pale blue eyes that were already doing the thing she hated most, assessing her. Most people leaked feeling constantly, their inner lives pressing against the skin of them, impossible entirely to contain. She had learned to read people this way before she could read words on a page, the involuntary tells of the emotional body, the fear that sharpened a voice, the love that softened a gaze, the guilt that made a person stand at a slight lean away from whoever they were lying to. This man was different. He radiated control so absolute it was its own kind of communication. This is a person who has learned that feeling is a vulnerability, and has spent years excising it. And underneath that control, buried deep as a root, she found something she had not expected. He was terrified. Not of her, not of the wolf, not of anything specific. It was older than that, more fundamental. A fear woven into the fabric of him, the kind that does not come from a single event but from the slow accumulation of a life spent confronting the thing one cannot stand. Silas Vane was afraid of the world. Afraid of anything that existed outside the categories he had created for it, anything wild, anything untamed, anything that refused to be understood on his terms. And so he had dedicated himself to caging those things. To owning them. "My name is Silas Vane," he said, studying her with the detached interest of an entomologist examining a pinned specimen. "That creature is mine. Property of some considerable value, once his spirit has been satisfactorily reduced." He tilted his head, and something flickered behind his pale eyes. "You found this place. The ward should have turned you away. You are not, I think, quite what you appear." He took a step forward. She smelled cologne, old paper, dried herbs, and something else, a metallic sweetness that she would later learn was dried blood, used in the kind of magic that required a price. "The fighting rings in the East will pay a remarkable sum for an authentic specimen," he continued, as though narrating to himself rather than speaking to her. "But first, the spirit must be broken. An unbroken will is dangerous. Unpredictable. An unpredictable investment is a liability." His gaze moved to the cage, and in it she saw something that lived next door to admiration without ever being it, possessive pride, the satisfaction of ownership. "He's almost ready." In the cage, the wolf had lifted his head. Those storm-gray eyes fixed on Silas, and the hatred that rolled from him was like a blast of heat, enormous, relentless, a rage so pure it was almost bright. But underneath it, aimed at her like an arrow, something else. A hope so fierce and fragile it made her breath catch. He knew what she was. And he was asking. "Run along, child," Silas said, his voice dropping to something flat and hard. The forest is full of dangers for those who wander where they don't belong. Accidents are common. Becca ran. She did not stop until the farmhouse fence was under her hands, her lungs burning, her legs shaking with the effort of having covered a mile at full sprint. She pressed her back against the weathered wood and slid down until she was sitting in the dirt, gasping. But even there, even across that distance, she could still feel it. That desperate, fragile hope, wrapped around her heart like a thread. She went back the next night. And the night after that. And the night after that. She learned the compound the way she had learned the farmhouse, not by being invited in, but by patient, careful attention. The guards changed at dusk. There were 5 of them, rotating through 3 shifts, and the transition window was 17 minutes long. The gap in the fence was on the eastern side, where a rusted section had broken away at the base. She could squeeze through on her belly, her dress be damned, and be at the cage in 40 seconds if she moved quickly. She moved quickly. 17 visits over 3 weeks. She counted them the way she counted her mother's lullabies, imprecisely, by feel, but knowing the number mattered. The wolf, she still called him that in her mind, though she was increasingly aware that wolf was insufficient, the way calling the sky blue was technically accurate but missing something essential, learned her. He learned the sound of her particular silence, the specific weight of her footstep, the way she smelled of pine and wool and the lingering farmhouse sense of soap and smoke. On her 3rd visit, he did not startle when she appeared. On her 5th, he moved toward the bars when she arrived rather than watching from the cage's interior. By the 7th, he was waiting for her. She brought food when she could, scraps from the larder, dried meat and hard cheese and twice a whole apple she had kept back from the harvest crate. She pushed these through the bars and watched him eat with that same deliberate dignity, that same refusal to simply be an animal. She had been around animals all her life and she knew the difference between eating from hunger and eating from choice. The wolf chose to eat. The distinction mattered to him. She felt that clearly. But food was not why she came, and they both knew it. What she brought was presence. Her attention, her warmth, her willingness to sit in the compound's dirt for hours at a stretch in the dark and cold of an October gradually becoming November. She brought him her empathy the way she had learned to offer it, not passively, not just receiving and enduring, but reaching out, sharing memories and feelings with the deliberate care of someone extending a hand across a very long distance. She showed him the forest, the deer she had followed, the hawk she had watched from the hillside, the particular quality of light on the first frost of autumn when every blade of grass became briefly its own lantern. She showed him the stream behind the farmhouse and the way it spoke, a language of water over stone that she had spent 4 years translating. She showed him what it felt like to climb to the top of the oak tree and find, just for a while, that she was high enough to be above the noise. And in return, the wolf gave her his past. Not in words. In impressions, in feelings, in the emotional residue of memory, a life vast and full and rich, now horribly reduced. She pieced it together visit by visit, like assembling a mosaic from the shards remaining after it has been shattered. A kingdom in the old forest, hidden from ordinary human eyes by wards of concealment older than any kingdom she had heard of. People who moved between shapes as easily as breathing, for whom the wolf was not a transformation but a second self, the other half of a whole. A royal line that had ruled this hidden country for centuries, maintaining the delicate peace between their kind and the ordinary world beyond the forest's edge. A mother, silver-haired, storm-eyed, whose love he carried in his chest like a physical weight. A father, long dead, remembered in the specific ache of old grief. Siblings, friends, a world of connection so densely woven she could feel it even at third hand, even filtered through years of imprisonment and the dulling fog of whatever Silas put in his food. His name. She received it on the 9th visit, in a bloom of emotion so distinct she knew immediately it was not a common name but a name he had chosen to give her, a trust. Leis. His people had called him Leis. He had been a prince. She pressed her hands against her eyes and breathed through the enormity of it. Crown Prince of the Silverwood Covenant. Hidden even from most of the Hidden Kingdom's own history, the shapeshifter clans who had kept their truce with the human world through centuries of careful diplomacy and careful concealment. Leis had been raised to inherit that peace, trained from childhood to understand its fragility, to tend it the way you tend a flame in a high wind, not by smothering it into safety, but by cupping it with both hands and moving very carefully. The curse that had taken him was not accidental. It had been designed. She felt this in the particular quality of the magic she sensed through the binding runes. It was not merely imprisonment, it was erasure, a spell built to work slowly, to grind away at the mind inside the animal form until nothing remained of the man and only the beast endured. Silas had not captured an already cursed wolf. Someone had cursed Leis so that Silas could capture him. She could not ask who. She did not yet know enough to ask. But she watched Silas during his visits, twice weekly, regular as a tax collector, a leather journal tucked under his arm and that pale assessing gaze moving over the cage with the professional satisfaction of a man checking on a profitable investment, and she watched the wolf, and she thought. Soon, she had heard Silas say one evening, not knowing she was crouched in the gap between two buildings, barely breathing. Another month and his spirit should be sufficiently reduced. The Eastern Rings will pay a fortune for a shifter prince. First confirmed royal specimen in 3 generations. A guard beside him had laughed, and jabbed a silver-tipped spear through the bars for sport, and Leis had flinched back with a yelp that split Becca's empathic sense like an axe through kindling, pain so sharp and specific she doubled over and gagged, pressing her fist against her mouth to stay silent. She had vomited in the bushes after. She had not gone home. She had waited until the pain subsided and the compound grew quiet, and then she had gone back to the cage and pressed her hand against the bars and offered him the forest, the stream, the hawk, the stillness. She offered everything she had. She had 17 visits, and on the 18th, everything broke. Uncle Hemer had been drinking. Becca could feel it before she saw him, the way alcohol loosened the knot of his daily suppression, letting everything he usually kept at a manageable simmer boil up and over the sides. His fear, especially. She had noticed it more over the past 2 weeks, that deep, gnawing dread that seemed to have taken up permanent residence beneath his resentment. Something had its hooks in him, something he was not telling anyone, something that made him flinch at the wrong moments and stare at walls when he thought no one was watching. She had meant to be invisible. She had learned to be invisible in this house. But he caught her at the back door, her coat already on, the night already waiting outside the window like a patient friend. "Where do you think you're going?" His hand closed around her wrist. Not hard enough to bruise, just hard enough to hold. His breath had the sharp, sweet rot of cheap whiskey. "Out to your precious forest. While I'm working myself to the bone trying to keep food on this table." She tried to pull away. He was stronger than his frame suggested. He dragged her into the parlor where Aunt Meredith sat with her darning and her emotional absence, her flat, affectless presence somehow more oppressive than any anger. "I ought to lock you in the cellar," he said. "Your mother left nothing but debt and heartache, and I've fed you for 5 years out of the goodness." "You fed her scraps," Meredith said, not looking up. "Don't make yourself charitable on it." Hemer's face flushed, rage spiking over the fear. He released Becca's wrist suddenly, as though she had burned him. "Just stay out of my sight," he said. "Go." She went. She waited until the house was still. She went out the window, down the oak, through the dark. She did not notice him following until she was already at the cage, her hand pressed to the bars, Leis's muzzle warm and real against her palm. Then she felt it, a spike of shock like cold water, coming from behind her. A familiar emotional signature, distorted beyond its usual dimensions by fear. Uncle Hemer stood at the edge of the compound, his face bone-pale in the moonlight, staring at the wolf with the expression of a man who has just understood, too late, that the world is larger and stranger and more dangerous than he had taken it for. "Becca." His voice cracked. "What have you done?" She turned toward him, tried to communicate with her hands, with her expression, with the vocabulary of gesture she had developed over years of necessary invention. He did not understand. He never tried to understand. Do you know what that man will do to us? His voice dropped to a ragged whisper. You'll get us both killed. She shook her head, tried to reach for his arm, but he stepped back from her. I have to tell him. She heard the decision crystallize in his voice, and felt it in the sudden desperate certainty of his emotional signature. If I tell Silas before he discovers it himself, if I prove I had nothing to do with this, he swallowed. Maybe he'll leave us alone. The betrayal hit her in the chest like a thrown stone, solid and sudden and leaving a bruise she would carry for a long time. She had known he did not love her. She had felt the truth of that every day for 5 years, the lukewarm obligation that stood where love should have been, the counting of what she cost against what she contributed. She had made her peace with it, the way you make peace with weather. She had not known he would trade her. He turned and ran, crashing back through the underbrush, and the sound of his departure was the sound of a door swinging shut on everything she had known. Leis pressed against the bars. She felt him before she turned, that fierce, determined certainty, no blame in it, no recrimination, just a decision made. If this was to be their ending, they would meet it together. Something broke open in Becca's chest. Or perhaps it had been breaking all along, slowly, night by night in this compound, visit by visit beside this cage, and only now shattered fully. She thought of her mother, who had loved her without qualification. She thought of 10 years of smallness, of silence, of being the burden that was tolerated but never wanted. She thought of the prince in his cage, dying by inches, and the man now running through the dark to sell him to his tormentor. She looked at the lock. The lock was a masterwork of mundane engineering reinforced with binding runes, designed to resist every method of conventional opening. She could see that immediately. It was not a puzzle to be solved with picks or leverage. It was a declaration, what is inside this cage is mine, and the cage cannot be opened without my permission. Becca had never tried to push outward with her gift before. She had never tried to do anything with it except endure it. But she placed both palms flat against the cold iron of the cage door, and she breathed through the pain of the runes, the empathic equivalent of pressing her hands into a fire, a shrieking protest from the part of her gift that sensed the magic in the metal, and she thought about what she had. She had her mother's love, so clearly remembered she could still feel the warmth of it on cold nights. She had the forest's peace, built up over years of refuge among honest creatures. She had Leis's own nobility, which she had been carrying as a gift for weeks now, his innate goodness present in her like a loan she had accepted and was only now ready to spend. She had rage. Rage at the cage, at the man who had built it, at the world that had allowed it to exist. She had the specific rage of someone who has watched a magnificent, complex, irreplaceable mind slowly destroyed for profit, and felt every moment of it, and been powerless to stop it. She had love. She understood this about herself in the moment before she acted. She had come to love Leis the way she loved the forest, not with the possessive, transactional quality of the farmhouse, but cleanly, completely, in the language of her gift, which was the language of pure being. She loved him the way she loved the hawk riding the thermal, without attachment to its sting, without demand, simply grateful for the reality of it. She poured everything into the lock. The emotion hit the binding runes like a wave hitting a cliff face. The cliff held for a moment, she felt the resistance, the ancient intention behind the metal pressing back against her, and then something in the mechanism changed its mind. The runes flared once, bright and agonizing, and then went dark. The lock's mechanism shifted, turned, released. The cage door swung open. Leis emerged slowly, with the careful dignity of something that has been forced to be small for a long time and is relearning what it means to take up space. In the moonlight, fully upright, he was magnificent. 7 hands at the shoulder, the size of a destrier, all silver fire and controlled power, his eyes blazing with a light that had nothing to do with moonlight and everything to do with what had just been returned to him. He could run now. The forest was right there, the shadows deep and welcoming, and he was large enough and fast enough that no man alive could catch him. Instead, he lowered his enormous head and pressed it against Becca's chest, directly over her heart. The gentleness of it unmade her entirely. She wrapped her arms around his neck, buried her face in the warmth of his fur, and wept without sound, as she had always wept. But this time the silence felt full rather than empty. She was understood. Completely, perfectly, without a single word. Whatever comes next, she felt him say, we face it together. Then the alarm bells began, they moved fast. Leis had been wounded and starved for months, but his body remembered what it was made for even when the rest of him had nearly forgotten. His stride ate distance in great rolling leaps, and Becca clung to the thick fur of his shoulders, her fingers threaded through it, her body low against his back the way she had seen riders position themselves on galloping horses. The wind pulled tears from her eyes. The forest blurred on either side of them, dark and close, branches whipping overhead. Behind them, shouts. The baying of hounds. Torchlight weaving between the trees. She felt Silas find her mind before she heard his voice. It was not sound. It was an intrusion, cold, deliberate, the mental equivalent of a hand thrust uninvited into a room and closing around something precious. Words assembled themselves in her thoughts with a precision that told her exactly what kind of man he was. You cannot run far enough, child. The wolf is mine, and you have made yourself my enemy. I will find you. I will make you watch as I skin him alive, and then I will teach you the full cost of stealing from Silas Vane. She clenched her jaw and pressed her face into Leis's fur and felt, beneath the genuine terror of those words, the truth she had sensed in him from the beginning. He was afraid. He was afraid because what had just happened, a small girl with a passive gift and a good heart, defeating his binding runes with nothing but emotion, was the kind of thing his categories had no room for. It was wild. It was untamed. It was exactly what he spent his life trying to eliminate from the world. She held on to that knowledge like a lantern in a dark room. They were 2 miles out when the crossbow bolt struck. She felt it happen before she understood what had happened, a sudden explosion of anguish through their connection, white-hot and silver-edged, Leis's stride breaking into a stumble, a howl that split the night and the forest and something inside her. She grabbed his fur to stay on as he nearly went down, felt the burning agony of the wound radiating through her palms, silver-tipped, the metal searing him from the inside out. He did not stop. Becca pressed herself lower against his back and pushed her calm through their connection, everything she had, poured it into him like water into a cracked vessel. Keep going. Keep going. You've carried yourself through worse than this. Keep going. He kept going. She knew where they were heading before she consciously remembered it. 3 miles west, where the old growth gave way to rocky foothills, the cabin that most people in the valley had written off as abandoned, but which she had watched with the careful attention of a child who had learned that the world's margins were often where its most interesting things lived. She had seen smoke from its chimney in winter. She had once glimpsed the old man who lived there, tall, broad, moving through his clearing with the deliberate competence of someone who had been doing difficult things alone for a very long time. She had never tried to find his door. Tonight she was desperate enough to knock on any door that opened. The forest thinned. Rock replaced earth beneath Leis's paws. And there, pressed against the foot of a massive granite outcropping and surrounded by rowan trees old enough that their roots had cracked the rock, stood the cabin. Leis made it to the porch before his legs surrendered. He went down slowly, with the controlled descent of something trying to protect its passenger even in collapse, and Becca slid from his back and hit the wooden boards and scrambled to her feet and pounded on the door with both fists. Her voice would not come, it never came, but she screamed everything she had into the wood with her gift, a wordless wave of urgency and terror and desperate need. The door opened. The old man was tall even in his age, white-haired and broad-shouldered, with eyes the precise gray-green of flint and a face that had been deeply weathered by time and weather and the kind of emotion that leaves marks. He took in the scene with a single sweep of those eyes, the collapsed wolf, the silver bolt, the crying girl, and she felt his emotional sequence in rapid order, shock, recognition, grief, and then a grim, competent determination that settled over everything else like armor being buckled on. By the old gods, he breathed, looking at Leis. Then he looked at Becca, really looked at her, and something shifted behind those flint eyes. "Get inside. Both of you. Now." His name was Alistair. He was the last of the wardens. The cabin was bigger inside than it appeared, or perhaps it was simply that the outside gave no impression of warmth, and the inside was unexpectedly, overwhelmingly full of it. Firelight. Books stacked in improbable arrangements against every wall. The smell of herbs drying in bundles from the ceiling, dried berries, old wood, the residual smell of decades of solitary living seasoned by something ancient and purposeful. When they crossed the threshold, Becca felt something shift in the air, the subtle pressure of old magic, like walking through a soap bubble, like stepping from one room into another where the acoustics were different. Wards. Strong ones, layered and nuanced, built over years rather than cast in a single working. Alistair slammed the door and threw 3 bolts. His hands moved in quick patterns at the doorframe, tracing symbols that glowed briefly and faded, reinforcing, Becca understood, shoring up the defenses in preparation for what was coming. He moved with the economy of someone who had done this before, who had prepared for this specific kind of night in the way a soldier prepares for a specific kind of battle. The crossbow bolt was the immediate concern. Silver-tipped, Alistair said, kneeling beside Leis with a kit that appeared in his hands as though it had been waiting for him. He examined the wound with careful, practiced fingers, his face steady. "They know what he is. They've known the whole time." He looked at the prince with an expression that compressed years of guilt and grief into something almost too heavy to watch. "Forgive me, my prince. I failed to find you in time. I will not fail again." Leis's eyes found the old man's face, and she felt the recognition in him, not just recognition, but something more layered, the complicated emotion of seeing someone you had given up believing you would see again. "I need your help," Alistair said to Becca. His eyes were direct and did not offer false reassurance. "This will hurt him. I need you to help him stay calm." She nodded and moved to Leis's head, pulling it into her lap. She pressed both hands into the silver fur of his mane and opened herself completely, held nothing back, all of it, everything she had, all the forest and the stillness and the love she had been carefully parceling out for weeks, she gave it now without reserve. A continuous offering. A lifeline she held with both hands. Alistair worked. 10 minutes that lasted longer than she had thought 10 minutes could. The silver bolt came out bloody and steaming, and Leis shook with pain she felt in every nerve of her body, but he held on, they held on together, her gift wrapping around his and holding them both steady, and when it was over, Alistair packed the wound with herbs that smelled of mint and something sharper, and bandaged it with competent efficiency, and sat back on his heels and looked at the girl who had not let go of the wolf's head for a single second. "He is no beast," Alistair said, his voice taking on the cadence she would come to associate with old knowledge, with things told rather than discovered. "He is Leis, Crown Prince of the Silverwood Covenant, the shape-shifter kingdom that has existed alongside the human world since before any of our recorded histories. What binds him was designed by a sorcerer named Morty the Black, a man of considerable power and considerable hatred for anything he could not control. The curse traps its victim in beast form, fully conscious, fully remembering, and works slowly to erode the distinction between prince and wolf. Another month, as you heard, and there would not have been enough of Leis left to save." He paused. Looked out the window. Looked back at her. "The curse can be broken," he continued. "But not by force. Not by countermagic. Only by an act of selfless love from a pure heart." He reached out and touched the silver locket at her throat, her mother's locket, the only thing she had from before. "Your silence is not a damage, child. It is a nature. You carry what the old texts call a silent heart, a soul that speaks the language of pure being, emotion unmediated by words. That is the old tongue, the first tongue, the language that existed before humanity divided thought from feeling by naming things." His gray eyes were intent. "That is why he trusts you. That is why you could reach him when no one else could." Something heavy hit the door. Then again. And again. "And now," Alistair said, rising and pulling a great war axe from its mount above the fireplace with the ease of long practice. We survived the night. The hounds came first. They were not ordinary dogs. Becca felt the corruption in them, natural instincts unwound from themselves and rewound wrong, the simple animal need to please transformed into a tool that served someone else's purpose. They threw themselves against the door in waves, claws scoring wood, teeth finding hinges, their distress a high, constant note beneath the violence. The wards held against them. Each time one made contact with the door, there was a flash and the smell of singed fur, and the creature fell back yelping. But the ward strained with each impact, the way a rope strains when something heavy is hung from it. You can see it hold, but you can also see the cost of holding. Then the hounds went silent. The new sound was worse, boots on rock, the clink of weapons, measured and purposeful. A dozen men, at minimum, taking positions around the cabin. Professional and patient. The axes started next. Each blow sent splinters flying from the door. Alistair cursed quietly and began tracing symbols in his own blood, cutting his palm without drama, pressing the symbols into the wood with practiced efficiency. Old magic, the kind that required a price to be paid. The wards blazed red and the assault faltered, briefly. A window imploded. Shadow poured through it like water finding a crack, Silas's shadow magic, the darkness he had summoned from wherever such darkness was kept. It moved across the floor with intention, with appetite, blackening the wood where it touched. Alistair's blood wards pushed it back, pushed and pushed, but he was fighting on two fronts now and she could feel the strain in him. Another window. Then another. Leis dragged himself to his feet. His wound blazed with pain, she felt every step he took, but he positioned himself between Becca and the door with his teeth bared in a snarl that was completely silent and absolutely unambiguous. He would die before he let anything through to her. "There's a root cellar," Alistair said, his voice carrying the particular flatness of someone prioritizing information over emotion. "Trapdoor behind the woodpile. Tunnel runs half a mile north. When they breach, and they will breach, take Leis and run." The door buckled. A hinge tore free. Becca looked at the door. At Leis, trembling with pain and determination. At Alistair, blood on his hands and the war axe gleaming in firelight, a man who had spent years alone in a warded cabin waiting for a moment he had expected and dreaded. She looked at her own hands, she had spent her entire life trying to keep other people's emotions out. She had built walls, careful, patient walls, constructed over years of enduring the constant assault of a world that had not been designed for someone like her, a world that leaked and broadcast and poured itself into the vessel of her without ever asking permission. She had learned which walls she needed in a farmhouse full of resentment. She had learned different walls for the village market and the church on the holy days and the rare occasions when Uncle Hemer took her to the town. She had learned to be small. To be quiet. To absorb what she could not deflect and pretend she felt none of it. The door burst open. 3 guards rushed in, weapons drawn, and behind them more in the darkness, and beyond them all, standing in the clearing with torchlight and his ancient book of shadows, Silas Vane. His cold eyes found her immediately. "Take the girl alive," he said, his voice absolutely without inflection. "Kill the old man. Cage the wolf." Leis lunged. Alistair's knives flashed. The cabin became chaos, motion, violence, the particular ugly efficiency of men who do this for money. Becca stood in the middle of it. And she let the walls fall. Not accidentally. Not in defeat. Deliberately, completely, with the full intention of someone who has decided, at last, to use what they have. The wave hit her like a physical blow. Hatred from the guards, thick and purposeful, the practiced loathing of men who need to dehumanize what they are paid to destroy. Greed, cold and bright. Bloodlust, which has a taste to it she had always found the most nauseating of human emotions, that specific pleasure that some people discovered, in themselves, in the suffering of others. It flooded through her empathic sense until she wanted to fold in half and she stayed upright. Because beneath all of it, she found herself. She found, in the center of the storm of borrowed emotion, her own light, the stillness she had discovered in the forest, years ago, before any of this. Her mother's love, so clear in her memory it was present rather than past. Leis's nobility, which she had been carrying like a gift for weeks and was only now ready to give back. Alistair's fierce, complicated loyalty. The hawk on the thermal. The stream over stones. Every good and honest thing she had ever witnessed or felt or been granted. She pulled. The locket at her throat began to glow. It started as a tremor, barely visible, and grew and grew. The light spread from the locket to her chest to her arms to her hands, filling her from the inside the way a lantern fills a room, and it changed as it spread. It was no longer simply her light, it was a mirror, it was the truth of herself held up to reflect the truth of what was being directed at her. She did not attack. She gave back. The wave of silver-white energy that swept from her was silent and complete and entirely without violence. It washed over the guards, over the hounds, over Silas, and it showed them. It showed them exactly what they were. The guards closest to the door dropped their weapons. She watched it happen as though from a great height, grown men folding to their knees, hands clasped over their faces, the collapse of people suddenly confronted with the accumulated weight of every choice they had been carefully not looking at. Not pain. Revelation. Every act of casual cruelty, every moment of deliberate suffering inflicted for coin or convenience, every time they had chosen the easy thing over the right thing, all of it present and undeniable, all at once, all real. One guard turned and ran. Another wept with the complete abandon of someone who had not wept in years and had forgotten he knew how. A third was simply still, kneeling in the doorway, and Becca felt the long, slow process beginning in him of a man deciding whether to be different. Silas Vane received the full force of it. She felt the impact through her gift, felt his carefully constructed fortress of self-control shatter like glass, felt the magnitude of what she had reflected pouring back into the man who had sent it. Beneath the control, beneath the cold blue eyes and the precise voice and the leather journal full of careful notes, was a person consumed by the terror he had always had of his own emptiness. He had traded his humanity for power so long ago that he had genuinely ceased to remember what it had felt like to be whole. The wild things he collected, the wolves, the shifters, the strange and untamable and uncategorizable, were not threats. They were reminders. Mirrors. Things that showed him, every time he looked at them, everything he had chosen to destroy in himself. The shadows he had summoned, drawing on that dark and hollow place where he had kept his fear for decades, turned. They found the darkness they had always been looking for. They found it in him. Silas Vane fell. The light from Becca's locket reached its peak. She had only a moment to register how strange it was, to be the source of light rather than the person hiding from it, and then it focused, all of it condensing into a single beam that struck Leis full in the chest. The wolf threw back his head and howled. She had never heard anything like it. It was not the sound of pain, though it contained pain. It was not the sound of ending, though it contained ending. It was the sound of something very old and very wrong finally being named correctly, being seen for what it had always been, and in being named, released. The howl echoed through the forest. Through the hills beyond the forest. Through whatever spaces existed alongside and underneath the mortal world, the hidden places where the Covenant's ancient magic had been quietly sustaining itself for centuries, waiting. And in the echo, a curse 3 years old and ancient at its roots finally shattered, silver fur became skin in the way that light becomes heat, fundamentally, the same energy, differently expressed. She watched it happen and felt it through their connection, the particular relief, so profound it registered as pain, of a body returning to its native form after years of foreign occupation. The wolf's shape rippled and compressed, massive limbs reshaping themselves with a grace that should not have been possible, light pouring from every inch of him like the sun coming from behind a cloud. When it was over, a man knelt in the clearing where the wolf had been. Young, perhaps 25, though his eyes were centuries older than his face. His hair was silver white and fell to his shoulders. His features were aristocratic, precise, carrying the same spare elegance she had felt in him even in wolf form, a man built for bearing things with dignity. He was pale from years of captivity, and thin, and there were marks on his skin that she understood, with her gift, were the places the binding runes had burned him, dark traces like old lightning scars. But he was upright. He was real. His eyes, when they found hers, were exactly the same. Storm gray. Still him. Still completely, entirely him. "You did not free the wolf," he said, his voice rough from 3 years of disuse, the words coming slowly at first and then with gathering certainty. His hands found hers and held them. She felt his emotions cycling through her palms, relief, gratitude, wonder, and beneath all of it, a love she had felt growing for weeks and now bloomed open like something that had been waiting for the right conditions. "You called the man back?" Becca cried. She cried silently, as she always had, tears streaming freely, and for once she did not try to stop or hide them. They were her voice in this moment, the only one she had, and she was not ashamed of them. Alistair stood in the ruined doorway of his cabin with wet eyes and the expression of a man who has lived long enough to see the things he believed in proven true. "By the old gods," he said, very quietly, to no one in particular. "By all the old gods." Silas's remaining men had fled into the forest. Their employer lay unconscious in the clearing, his shadows dissipated, his magic collapsed inward. He was breathing, Becca checked, because she was that kind of person, but he would not be a problem tonight. "Bind him," Leis instructed, his voice finding command as naturally as his feet had found the ground. "With cold iron. He'll face justice, from the Covenant and from the human authorities both. His fighting rings have been running for years. There are families who have been waiting for an accounting." Alistair, already moving, paused. "Your Highness," he said, the title carrying 3 years of guilt and relief in it, "what about the girl?" Leis looked at her. She had felt his question forming before he asked it, had felt the shape of it in his emotional signature, the careful hopefulness of it. He dropped to one knee so they were level, the same position a man takes when he is asking something important. "You gave me back my life," he said. "You gave me back myself. I am not asking you to repay a debt or fulfill an obligation. I am asking because I believe you belong somewhere that you have not been yet, somewhere that will see you as you are and give you room to grow into it." He paused. "Come with me. Not as a subject. Not as a ward. As family. The Silverwood celebrates gifts like yours. You would not be the girl who cannot speak there. You would be the silent heart who shattered the unbreakable curse." She thought about the farmhouse. She thought about the attic room with the thin mattress and the cold draft from the window she had learned to stuff with rags. She thought about Uncle Hemer's face when he had chosen his fear over her safety. She thought about this, Leis had taken a silver bolt for her. He had twisted his body at the last moment, in the dark, at a dead run, to put himself between her and an arrow. That was not obligation. That was not transaction. That was love, clearly and completely, in the language they both spoke. She nodded. Leis's smile was the first fully human smile she had seen in 3 years of visiting that cage, and it was, against all reason, familiar. She knew this smile. She had felt its precursor, cautious, fragile, tested against reality night after night, and this was what it had always been building toward. "Then we go home," he said. "Both of us." The journey to the Silverwood capital took 3 days. They traveled on forest paths that existed in the overlapping spaces between the ordinary world and something older, roads that required a certain quality of attention to see, which meant that ordinary travelers simply did not find them, their eyes sliding off like water off glass. The royal guard that arrived at dawn was a dozen riders, half of whom shifted between human and wolf forms as naturally as changing pace, and they treated Becca from the first moment with a matter-of-fact respect that she found, initially, bewildering. On the second day, one of the guards, a young woman named Sarah with brown skin and quick eyes and the emotional signature of someone genuinely delighted with her work, reined in beside her and offered an explanation. "Word travels in the Covenant," Sarah said. Everyone knows what you did. A silent heart who broke the black curse. The binding runes on that cage were designed by Morty himself. 5 of our best working mages tried to crack them in the first year after the prince went missing. None of them could touch it. She looked at Becca with something that was not quite awe but was in the same family. You were 10 years old. Becca shrugged. She had not thought of it as power. She had thought of it as necessity. That's what power usually is, Sarah said, as if she had heard the thought. She hadn't. The guards were not empaths, but people who paid attention were sometimes very nearly the same thing. The capital was nothing like any city Becca had imagined. She had imagined stone, cobblestones, the particular gray geometry of human settlements, walls and towers and the compression of many lives into small space, the emotional noise of it all pressing against her gift like a crowd pressing against glass. What she found instead was something that had grown rather than been built, a city the trees themselves had agreed to become. Homes spiraling up trunks the diameter of houses. Bridges of woven branch and living wood connecting platforms 60 feet above the forest floor. Light filtering through canopy layers that changed color with the altitude, deep green at the bottom becoming golden and then blue-white at the highest levels. People moved through it on 2 legs and 4, shifting mid-conversation, mid-task, mid-meal, as naturally as a person might shift from sitting to standing. Children chased each other through the lower branches, their laughter in both their shapes equally joyful and unmistakably the same laugh. Merchants sold goods at stalls built into the sides of ancient trees, and their customers moved between their human interest and their animal delight without seeming to notice the transition. The emotional landscape of it nearly brought her to her knees. Not because it was overwhelming, though it was, after the farmhouse and the compound and 3 days of travel and everything that had happened. Because it was good. Genuinely, complexly, humanly good, not perfect, not without its small griefs and frustrations and anxieties, but fundamentally oriented toward care. Toward each other. The Silverwood Covenant had built, over centuries, a place where being exactly what you were was not a liability. She had never been anywhere like it. She had not known anywhere like it existed. Queen Era met them at the Heart Oak, the grandmother tree of the capital, so ancient its trunk required a dozen people to encircle, its roots buckled and exposed like the knuckles of an enormous sleeping hand. The queen was everything Becca had glimpsed in Leis's memories, tall, silver-haired, storm-eyed, a formality of bearing that she wore like armor and beneath which blazed the banked fires of a mother who had not dared to hope for 3 years. When she saw her son, she made no sound. She crossed the distance between them with the careful dignity of someone who has held themselves together through an impossible time and knows that if she moves too quickly the holding will shatter, and she took his face in her hands and looked at him for a long moment, and Becca felt the full weight of what crashed through the queen in that moment. A tidal wave of relief and gratitude and the very specific joy of a parent seeing a child return from somewhere the parent could not follow. "My son," Era said. Nothing else for a moment. Then, "My son." She held him. Then she turned to Becca, and without the formality, she knelt. "And you," she said gently, "must be the one who saved him." Her eyes were her son's eyes. The silent heart. She reached out and touched the locket still resting at Becca's throat. "Your mother's." Becca nodded. "She raised you well," the queen said. It was the most precisely correct thing anyone had ever said to her. She felt its truth ring like a struck bell. "Welcome home, child. You are part of this family now, and you will never be alone again." 1 year later. Becca sat in the crook of her favorite oak, 40 feet above the forest floor, watching the sunset turn the sky over the Silverwood capital into something that looked like a painting made by someone in love with light. She had turned 11 2 months ago, or near enough. The exact date was uncertain, which had seemed like a lack until Alistair pointed out that uncertainty was not the same as absence, and that choosing a day was not less real than being given one. They had chosen the day the leaves first changed color, which meant her birthday was different every year, which she found she loved. The celebration had been extraordinary. Music and food and gifts she had never imagined owning. Sarah had given her a set of throwing knives with silver-chased handles and offered to teach her to use them. Alastair had given her a book, handwritten, old, one of only 3 copies of a text called The Silent Tongue, a history and practice, which was, she had discovered with her heart hammering, a comprehensive record of people like her throughout the Covenant's history. People who had spoken the language of pure feeling. What they had done. What they had been to their communities. She was not, it turned out, unprecedented. She was not broken. She was a type. Leis had given her the locket back, not her mother's, which she already had, but one he had commissioned, the same silver metal, but larger, and inside it was a portrait painted by one of the Covenant's miniaturists. Her mother, reconstructed from Becca's own memories as best as the painter could render them, the way she had looked on a specific afternoon that Becca had described through feeling rather than words. She had not been able to look at it for a week. Then she had been able to look at nothing else for a week. Now she wore it beside her mother's original, and the two of them rested against her sternum like a conversation. Below, the capital moved through its evening. Children's laughter, some on 2 legs and some on 4. Merchants closing stalls. Families gathering, the domestic warmth of it rising through the canopy to where she sat. The emotional landscape was as complex as any human settlement, full of love and frustration and hope and small sorrows and large joys, but the key in which it was played was fundamentally different from the farmhouse. It was a music that went somewhere. It was not simply noise. She was working with the Elder Watchers, 3 of the Covenant's most experienced empaths, who had been waiting, without entirely knowing it, for a student like her. It was hard work. The practice of shielding was not about building walls but about developing what her primary teacher Warden Seleth called the skin between worlds, a permeable membrane that could filter, that could choose, that could open to connection without being subsumed by it. She was learning to move through crowds without losing herself. Learning to reach out to others with deliberate care rather than helpless exposure. Learning that her gift was not a wound but a sense, and that like any sense, it could be educated, refined, given direction. She was getting better. Stronger. She still could not speak. The Watchers had tested everything and consulted everywhere and brought in specialists from 3 distant communities, and the conclusion, which she had suspected for years, was that her silence was not a damage. There was nothing to fix. Her voice existed in the language she spoke naturally, the language that had broken a 3-year curse and shattered the malice of a practiced sorcerer and called a prince back from the brink of himself. It was simply not a spoken language. She was entirely, completely, permanently okay with that. There you are. She looked down. Leis stood at the base of the oak, looking up at her with those storm-gray eyes. He was different at home, not different in himself, but expanded, the full version of what she had felt in him even in the cage. There was an ease to him here, a sense of a person fully inhabiting their life rather than enduring its absence. He had been working for the past year on the complicated business of being a returned prince, the political recalibration, the relationships that had changed in his absence, the understanding of what had been done to him and by whom and why. It was not easy work. She felt the weight of it on him sometimes, in the evenings, when the day had asked more than it had given. On those evenings, she climbed down from her oak and sat beside him, and offered him what he had once needed from her, the forest. The stream. The hawk. The stillness. He received it with the same gratitude he had received it with in the cage. Some things, she had found, did not change. The things that mattered tended not to. "The Queen is asking after you," he called up, his voice carrying the warmth she had come to understand was specifically for her. "Dinner is apparently an event tonight. Something about the autumn solstice." She raised an eyebrow. "Sarah is also asking after you," he added, and I believe the phrase, "complete catastrophe," was used in relation to the throwing knives training, but she seemed more delighted than concerned. Becca covered her mouth to hide what was almost certainly visible on her face. "I'm coming down now," she communicated through approximately 2 seconds of focused empathic intent. Leis caught the meaning perfectly, as he always did, and stepped back to give her room as she began her descent through the branches. She had spent 10 years being the person that nothing was built for. She had spent 10 years being small, and quiet, and invisible, and enduring. She had spent 10 years in a house full of resentment and absence, feeling the emotional landscape of everyone around her with no ability to choose what she received, no framework for understanding what she was, no language for explaining herself even to herself. And then a dying wolf had looked at her through the bars of a cage, and recognized her. The rest, the cage and the compound and the chase through dark trees and the siege and the shattered curse and the journey to a city built in ancient oaks, the rest had followed from that recognition the way every downstream thing follows from a source. She had been seen. She had been understood. She had been spoken to in the language she had always known. She had answered. She had answered with everything she had, and it had been enough. More than enough. She dropped from the last branch and landed in the carpet of fallen leaves at the oak's roots, and Leis was there, and the capital was full of light and warmth, and somewhere above them a hawk, a real one, just a hawk, one of the Covenant's many inhabitants with no allegiances but the sky, rode the last thermal of the evening upward, outward, until it was a single dark shape against a sky the color of embers. She watched it until it disappeared. Then she turned toward the warmth and the light and the people who had learned to hear her, and she went home.